And I want to suggest that crony capitalism by its very nature implies, can you hear me in the back all right? Implies failing capitalism, and that I believe what we have in America today is a rolling microphone, is not capitalism, but corporate socialism. And other speakers have talked about how we are developing a society in which we privatize gains, and we socialize risks. And in examining how we got here, I want you to keep in mind two important numbers, 1980 and 37. 1980 is when Ronald Reagan's election changed the course we were on. And whether you love or hate Mr. Reagan, he dramatically changed the course of the country and is therefore, by definition, a great leader. The second number is 37. That is the median age. Half of all Americans are younger and half are older. More than half of Americans were not born when Mr. Reagan was elected. And if you think most people don't have much of a political consciousness until they're 18, that means that more than 60% of Americans, in fact nearly 2/3, have lived under and only know Reaganism, which is the era that we are still in. Barack Obama is very much part of Reaganism, so was Bill Clinton. Now, I believe that our current travails with our capitalist system come from two places. The University of Chicago and its star academic Milton Friedman and Ralph Nader. And I'll show you about Mr. Nader in a moment. Much of this conference has talked about lending, and lending is a business which has always been regulated. What I teach at Syracuse is the history and philosophy of business regulation in one class and property and taxes in the other, where I try to get students to understand how did we get here? And I point out to them that the ancients worked out everything. They had wage and hour courts in Egypt 3,700 years ago, for example. And Hammurabi's code has rules about everything from lending to the serving of drinks in bars, at least if the bar is owned by a woman. And one of the stories that I teach my students is a novella from 1400 before the Common Era called The Eloquent Peasant. And it's the story of a man who takes everything he and his wife can put together, wild birds they have caught, cloths she's made, and other things, and he loads them onto a donkey and goes to market. And he's walking down a path which runs along the Nile River in the middle of a field. And in the distance, the overseer who works for the landowner, and it's important to understand that Egypt was a society where government contractors built the pyramids. There was a very well-established business community. The overseer of a wealthy man's land tells one of the slaves to grab a cloth, runs down to where the man is coming with his donkey, puts the cloth down, which means that the man cannot pass under Egyptian law. And the man is asking, well, what am I supposed to do? There's enough room to turn the donkey around. I can't go down into the river. There are crocodiles. And he's doing this. The donkey reaches over and takes a wisp of barley. Whereupon immediately the man is seized, his property is taken from him as recompense for this theft of barley, and he's beaten. And so he goes to one of the courts in Egypt, and the story gets to the pharaoh, who is fascinated that this man can articulate his cause, and he issues an instruction first to go take care of the wife and children and see to it that they're fed, and then to not tell anyone in the court, but that he wants a report back every day of what this man says, and he wants him to come back every day. And for 9 days, this young man comes back, and as time goes by, he becomes more and more eloquent. And on the 9th day, he finally says, you know, if you who are immortal and get to live forever can steal from those of us who have nothing and whose bones will turn to dust, what option do you leave us with but to steal from you? At which point, the pharaoh calls in the landlord, who says, is asked about this, and the landlord says he believes that perfectly fair recompense for the theft of the barley because of the donkey is to take the man's property. And the pharaoh says, okay, fair enough. Everything that was yours is now his. Now, that story was taught to every single high-born Egyptian because it's about how far you can push people before you will have trouble. You will have a revolt. And in fact, there were several revolts during the 3,300-year reign of the Egyptian government. We seem to have lost sight of this as a fundamental rule that you can only push people so far. We have adopted this idea promoted by Milton Friedman in the New York Times that the sole duty of the managers of a corporation is to the owners of the corporation. So you may own the stock for 1 minute and you matter and you have rights. Even though you're a speculator, you are using borrowed money. And as I proved in my book, Perfectly Legal, in some cases, borrowed money at a rate of 250 to 1, not the claimed 30 to 1 of hedge funds. You have rights, but the person who works there their whole career, they're just to be used. And they are not to be considered in any equation except how to get the maximum work out of that person. Now, developing this idea and making it our dominant public policy has required a long-term strategy. It has involved weakening the counter forces. The biggest one of these, of course, is unions, which gave a sense of power to people who generally do not feel powerful. And human beings are, after all, fundamentally herd animals. We tend to follow leaders. It's one of the reasons human society works. So if you can take away leaders who have an opposite viewpoint, undercut their economic capacity and their connection to people, you can strengthen your own position. We've seen a dramatic drop in religious training and education in this country, and the rise of a bizarre form, I would argue, of religious training that basically says that the greatest moral value is to get rich, something I can't find in all my study of the Bible and the Quran and the Old Testament. Then there's a role of the press, which I will come back to later. And finally, there has been the rise of 12 big ideological marketing organizations like Cato and Heritage, which I believe were created by the people like the Koch brothers, the family that owns Coors Beer, the Olin family and others, because when Ralph Nader came along in the 60s and started showing through research what was going on in America, interlocking boards of directors, mistreatment of taxpayers, various abusive practices, their response was actually a very, very thoughtful one. Hey, we need to copy that. That seems to work. And so that's what they did. They created these organizations and funded them very well, and they are treated by the news media as if they are some source of wisdom and knowledge when they're in fact no different than Madison Avenue firms that when I was a young man would tell you that you wanted to put grease in your hair because a little dab will do you, and other ridiculous things that they were there to sell. And that's what these ideological marketing organizations do, and do very, very well. Then the next step is you need to weaken government. So we have taken the IRS and radically cut, as I've written about in Perfectly Legal and the New York Times and elsewhere, radically cut auditors, radically cut resources, so that we have fewer and fewer audits at the bottom. But in one area, our Congress since 1995 has been increasing spending, and that is audits of the working poor, until we got to the point in 1999 where you were more likely to be audited if you made less than $25,000 a year than if you made more than $100,000. There's also a clear understanding that bureaucracies do what they're told. If you tell a bureaucracy, we want you to police Wall Street, we want you to look for systemic damaging practices, that's what they'll do. And if you tell them, that's not your business, don't look, don't ask, that will happen. So we end up with rules like the one at the SEC that said that the staff could not begin investigations without the approval of the commission. Imagine that, think about that. You're a homicide detective in a city, and you get told, well, you can't go investigate the homicide and go after this suspect until the city council votes on it. That's ridiculous, but it is the practice that we are following in our government. And I would point out that the little minor efforts we make to address these things, like the creation of the CFIC, its budget was less than 1/4 of the budget spent investigating Bill Clinton's dalliance with an intern. Finally, you need to co-opt. And no better example that I can think of co-opting government than the FBI's 2004 announcement, which you can still go read on the web, that it decided there was a problem with mortgage fraud. And as others have pointed out, plenty of us knew, wrote about, and told people there were problems going on with mortgages. The FBI's announcement says something very important that hasn't been mentioned here today. It describes mortgage fraud as one of two crimes. It is either buying a home that you know you can't afford, which you will occupy until you lose it, or buying a home in the expectation that you can flip it to someone else before you lose it. And then it announces that the FBI is partnering with the Mortgage Bankers Association. What the FBI did was literally partner with the people who were actually creating this problem and who were at the core of the problem. And that's how you co-opt, so that you get to the point where one of the smartest U.S. attorneys that I know in America, Ben Wagner, who is the U.S. attorney in Sacramento, one of the few guys who was willing to take on tax cases, which is why I know Ben, was quoted by a friend of mine, another journalist, David Heath, as saying that he couldn't understand these claims about mortgage fraud by banks. What bank, he said, would possibly make a loan that they know can't be paid back? Well, obviously, the U.S. Justice Department never gave training to any of its bankers explaining that that's not how bank loans work anymore. If banks had to eat their cooking, in fact, they wouldn't make loans that can't get paid back, with the rare exception of outright corrupt loans. And we will always have corruption. That's not the fundamental problem. It's systemic problems that are at the core. It is the structure. All of these things and many others together have accomplished the following. They have separated reward from responsibility. You will hear constantly risk and reward, which people don't understand, and they don't understand that, in fact, the higher the risk, the greater the chance you will lose money. A high level of risk really means over time that you concentrate among a narrow group of winners, the outliers, if you do a game, for example, where you continually have high risk. Fewer and fewer people will end up with more and more. But what we've done is we've taken, and mortgage loans are a perfect example of this, but they are not the only one. We have separated reward from responsibility. Now, a big reason for this is the invention of VisiCalc. VisiCalc was the original computer spreadsheet, developed about 30 years ago. Up until the time of VisiCalc, there was literally a job title in which you'd say, what do you do? I'm a computer. Because that's how computations were done. People did them. They sat and did them by hand. There were abacuses in some societies. There were some mechanical machines, but there were people whose job was to be a computer. Once we developed spreadsheets, heck, I can figure out net present value. I can project it real easily. And so imagine what people who are really deeply trained in these things are able to do. Well, one of the things they're able to do is take a product, let's say a mortgage, persuade people you can afford this mortgage. It's at 1.9% interest for the first 5 years, and then it will reset. And when you look at the reset, if you assume it resets at the maximum and it keeps resetting because it annually resets and it's a 30-year mortgage, the net present return, if the mortgage pays off, might be 11% a year. And you reduce that to a net present value, you pay a big commission to someone for selling this and guiding the borrower, who doesn't know very much, away from understanding what's going on, and then you collect your fee. And if you're the originating bank, like Countrywide, you then sell this product, which, when you just look at a spreadsheet, appears to be phenomenally profitable, and you collect a big fee, and you no longer are responsible for it. Computer spreadsheets are a fundamental and underappreciated aspect of separating risk from responsibility. You know, the funny thing about net present value is I can calculate, if everything works out, how much you'll make today, but why in the world would I pay you today until the profits actually materialize? That's the question. That's how we separated risk from responsibility. If we had said to everybody along the way, by the way, you'll get your standard fee for doing a loan, and if this pays off, just stay in touch with us, and you're going to collect your fee X number of years down the road. Now, in essence, what I'm describing is mismeasuring and mispricing. And there's another area where mismeasuring and mispricing has encouraged the non-capitalist system we have today we call capitalism. And that's directors and officers insurance. When Angelo Mozillo came to his limited judgment in a civil matter, there was no criminal case going to be brought against him, there was a penalty to be paid of $60-some million. Most or all of that, we only know about how part of it was paid, but I will not be surprised to find out that all of it was paid on his directors and officers' liability insurance, because both the company had a policy and presumably as an executive he had a policy. And he had little or no cost out of his pocket for this. Now, the likelihood that you will get in a car crash is used to price your car insurance. The neighborhood you live in, the density of automobiles, which is the single biggest indicator of the likelihood of an accident, your driving record, your age, are all taken into account. Health insurance. I have a little company that I'm the chairman of. One of the things I find most annoying is it's none of my business who my employees sleep with, love, where they go to church, what car they drive, but their health status is my business. That's crazy, but it is. And that's because healthcare is risk-related. This country is full of people who no one will sell insurance to, even in a group, because of some medical misadventure, sometimes insignificant things or even temporary traumas that went away. They cannot buy health insurance at any price, or they pay such ridiculous prices that it's not attainable for mere mortals. Directors and officers insurance is not risk rated. Logically, in a properly priced market, you would say, well, what's the reputation of this executive? What is the balance sheet of this company? What's its practices? You would look at things like the control fraud issues that Bill has done so well, along with others, to try and explain. It's pretty hard when there's a big wall that says, don't listen, but tried hard to explain. But we don't do that. Instead, it's, well, listen, if we can have the life insurance on your workers and the P&C insurance on all your buildings and the workers' comp and all these other lines, for very little we'll throw in the D&O insurance. We need a law that says D&O insurance must be freestanding and risk-rated. Likewise, you weaken audits. My column at Reuters today is about the continuing scandal of audits that fail to catch frauds that go on for years and years and years. There's actually a parallel movement to the work that Bill and others at this conference have done, examining what's wrong with the auditing business. And it's not like we don't know. We know exactly what's wrong with it. It is totally mispriced. It is mismeasured. And we will continue to have scandals where assets don't exist, as with Olympus in Japan, or losses are hidden. And we've had these again and again and again because we don't get the rules right. And then finally, we have something that grew out of the savings and loan scandal that I am, I believe, the only mainstream press person has ever written about. At least the last time I looked in Nexus, I couldn't find any writings but my own. It used to be that professional partnerships, law firms and accounting firms, were organized as partnerships in which each partner is individually and separably liable. So if Bill is my partner and Bill is doing something crooked, I can lose my house, because there's no veil here to protect me as with a corporation. The Texas legislature, in response to the S&L crisis, passed the first law allowing limited liability partnerships. And under a limited liability partnership, I'm encouraged to do two things. If Bill and I are partners in an accounting firm, we're going to do everything we can to take money out of the firm. We want to have everything we can with the minimal amount of assets in the firm, which means we get to realize the income now. And then secondly, if I think Bill's up to something troubling, the last thing I want to do is go into his office and say, what in the hell are you doing? Because now I've made myself liable. We have taken a virtuous system and turned it into a vicious system. That doesn't mean there aren't problems. If you want to have nationwide or worldwide partnerships, it creates problems under partnership law. But we didn't tinker and fix with those. We threw out a virtuous system for one that is vicious in its nature. Now, the reason that nothing is happening about this is very simple. People just can't imagine that the business leaders they see on television and they watch Walking with the President of the United States and on who their job depends are anything other than sterling and honest people. Yeah, people will sort of bitch and kvetch, but they really don't want to think that things at the top could be really bad. And I'll give you an analogy of that. Think about two of them actually. Think about all the people who knew perfectly well because their kid or somebody else's kid had been molested by a priest who didn't do anything about this open scandal that went on for decades in the Catholic Church. And the press will play a little role in this, which I'll come to in just a second. And then secondly, look what happened in Pennsylvania yesterday at Pennsylvania State. You had students rioting over a crime the anal rape of a 10-year-old boy, which the news media politely calls molesting. And the students are angry that the head of that school, the man who was virtually God in that community, was fired from his job. There's a real values problem in America, which goes back to the breakdown of the churches that I mentioned earlier. Then there's the role of the press in this. It's important to understand that most reporters only know how to quote other people accurately. They really don't know how things work. Very, very few journalists have ever taken a course in public administration, in statistics, in how various things happen. It's less true when you write about science or medicine, but true generally of most reporters. Very few reporters have studied policing as a science. And so what they tend to report is what they are told. A few years ago, we had questions, why aren't certain scandals being discussed in the press in Washington? Well, because the Democrats wouldn't talk about them. And they were Republican scandals, and the Democrats wouldn't talk about them, then there was no way to write a story about it. You could say this happened and that was the end of it. Where were you going to go if you depend on sources to tell you what to do? Very, very few journalists operate like I do on their own authority. And it's because that's a very risky thing to do. And not long ago, I wrote a column in Reuters. I had a bunch of journalists call me about it. One of them said to me, well, who announced this? And I said, I guess I did in my column. I just took the government figures and analyzed them. Oh, I don't think we're going to be able to do anything. We need someone official to say this. That's a real problem. What I call he said journalism. But there's another side to this. I don't think the public has any idea how much corporate America bullies journalists. Now, at the New York Times, as at Reuters, I have absolutely sterling editors with backbones. If somebody's griping about me to Reuters, I'll never hear about it. I never heard about it at the New York Times, but I knew about things. Among other things, I would have corporations tell me they were going to do these things. And reasonably, if you were my editor and you see me come into your office, and it's the 87th time I've been to your office, you know in your heart, oh, it's going to ruin my week. You know, can't you just go write a nice story somewhere? And it wears people down. The criticisms you see of Wall Street, particularly if you read the deal book section of the New York Times, are the criticisms that Wall Street accepts. But they're not underlying questions. No one discusses control fraud, and if they do, it'll happen and then disappear. Well, we've now reported that, and we can go on. When I reported about how General Electric's own documents showed that for years, decades, it had been systematically cheating state-level governments in Brazil out of VAT taxes, sending all the light bulbs and light fixtures they were manufacturing in Brazil to the Amazon, where, of course, there can't be anybody to buy them. General Electric went just crazy attacking my work. I left the New York Times with that story. It was published in a little nonprofit publication called Tax Notes International. And GE sent down a jet load of lawyers and executives and told, I was not there, but I get this story secondhand, and told them basically, we'll put you out of business if you don't denounce this story. And they said, hey, we'll run any letter you want. Anything you want to say, we'll run it. And by the way, what's wrong with the article? Well, it's all wrong. Well, no, that's not an answer. You have to show something specific. But think about that. Here's a $200 billion a year corporation saying to this little tiny nonprofit, if you don't do what we say, we will put you out of business. Fortunately, they had backbone. They stood up. Lots of people won't, particularly whose own fortune is that they own the enterprise. Finally, we have the corruption of academic economists. If you're a journalist at a major news organization, you have to tell your bosses all about your activities. I had to get permission at Reuters to be able to put $100 a month into buying a particular stock that we inherited some of through the DRIP plan and just adding a little bit of money to it. One of only 2 stocks that I own. Academic economists, if any of you have seen Inside Job, you will see the Glenn Hubbard, head of the business school at Columbia, threatened to walk out when he's asked about his outside consulting work. This is completely corrupt. And those of you who are academics, you need to go back to your college presidents, to your faculty senates and elsewhere. This has got to stop. At a minimum, there has to be 100% disclosure of outside activities by academic economists and on their consulting work. And I'm astonished it isn't. Doctors who do medical research are supposed to do this stuff. Pharmaceutical researchers are supposed to do this stuff. Biologists who work with those companies do it. Why do we treat academic economists differently? Now, all of this comes from the Chicago School and the response of the business community in saying, you know, that Nader guy is onto something. We need to duplicate what he's doing. And that led to the rise of these big 12 ideological marketing organizations. The underlying problem here is the structure is all wrong. The ancients worked out this stuff. We know what profit is. The Medicis figured out everything you need to know about risk and reward in lending. We know how much spread you need to make in lending. The fundamental problem is that we have put in place a set of rules which the behavioral economists are slowly knocking down, sold by Friedman and others, that assume a certain kind of model behavior because it works on paper that has nothing to do with human reality. And until we recognize that as a society and we start pushing for it, this will just continue to happen. We will continue to have what we have now, which is a massive redistribution from the many to the few, something, by the way, that the common religious text of Jews, Christians, and Muslims describes as evil, the Old Testament, and we will continue to have bad economic performance. And that's the core of this. It is the rules. We need to fix the rules. So, thank you.